Okay, let's jump right in. Today I'm going to be doing something a little different and showing you how I go about drawing textures. First, we'll start with some bricks. The first thing I do is to draw parallel lines. I'm taking care to make sure that these are evenly spaced apart, as they will become the individual rows of bricks. And now that that's done, I'll start to add some vertical lines that separate each brick. Now, for the second row, you'll notice that I have placed the lines in between the lines from the row below. This will give the bricks that offset staggering effect. And the last step before I go into shading will be to draw all of the other vertical lines that makes up all of the other bricks. Now you can see that I'm speeding things up a little bit by drawing the lines on every other row. I just found it easier to keep my bricks aligned when I do it this way. The next step is to shade the bricks. I'm going to be using my Copic N2 light gray marker to lay down a base color. This stage is going to add some definition to the bricks, but it's really the last step that makes these bricks really pop. Now, the nice thing about alcohol markers is that you can build up the layers with the same color, and you'll get a slightly deeper shade. And that's what I'm going to be doing right now. I'm selecting a few random bricks and just building up the shade on that brick so it's a little deeper. And once that's done, I'm going to switch over to my dark gray marker and go back over all of the lines. This is going to give the illusion of the mortar in between the bricks, and it also helps add a little depth to my texture. And speaking of texture, I'm going to be using a stippling technique to add a bunch of dots to each brick to imply that rough brick surface. Now let's talk about light source for a second. In my mind, I see the light source coming from the top left of my scene, and that is why these bricks have the stippling down on the bottom right edge of each brick. And that's because I'm implying a shadow toward that edge. Now, the stippling process can be tedious, but I kind of enjoy this technique, so it's a little soothing for me. But it's really the next step after we complete the stippling that makes these bricks look complete. Now, this would be a good opportunity to mention that if you enjoy what you're seeing, please give me a like or even a subscribe, or let me know in the comments if you'd like to see more. And as I wrap up the stippling, I'm going to go back to my pen and I'll trace each and every brick. However, I'll be rounding out each corner. This gives each brick a more natural look while adding additional depth to my texture at the same time. It's really this little trick here that takes this brick to the next level, in my opinion. Now, for the next texture, we're going to draw some wood grain. And to start with this, I'm going to draw a couple of vertical lines, and these will be the individual wood boards. Now, once that's done, I'm going to start adding the grain to each board. There are a couple of techniques I go about drawing wood grain, and for this first board, I'm going to start by just creating a really thin oval. And now it's a matter of drawing slightly larger ovals radiating outward. And at a certain point, you'll see me change directions of the grain, and I'll just keep drawing lines close to another until the entire board is covered. And that's pretty much the same technique I'll use on the remaining boards. It's just a matter of where do I start that oval, or sometimes I might start with a V shape, as if the oval is outside of view. So again, it's just a matter of drawing larger and larger V shapes until I have the entire board covered with the texture. Now for the shading, I'm going to be using the same process that I did with the bricks, and that is to start with a base color. In this case, I'm using the same light gray. And then once that's done, I'll switch over to the darker gray and fill in the negative areas between each board. Again, using the same technique with the brick to build up the color, I'm going to be layering the light gray color to get that slightly deeper shade in random areas of my grain. So you'll notice I'll go throughout each board and pick a couple of grain paths and just darken those up. Now, the very last thing I'll do is grab my darkest gray and just darken up the areas in between each board. This is just going to give another layer of depth. The final texture, we're going to draw some stone. And this one is pretty simple. It starts out with an oblong shape, kind of like a distorted circle, and then it's a matter of placing additional shapes around the first one. The trick here, though, is to try to get those shapes as close as you can and not get yourself in a situation where you're creating an unusual kind of shape, kind of like I did in the bottom right corner. You'll notice for my texture, I did leave a lot of space between my stonework. That just means there's more mortar between the stones. But this texture also works really well if you draw these shapes where the lines are touching. Additionally, you can change up the size of your stones. In this case, all my stones are around the same size. However, you can get a cool effect if you throw in a bunch of smaller stones in between the large ones. Moving on to shading, we're going to approach this very similar to the last two textures, but with a small twist. I'll start with my light gray, but I'm going to be drawing around the edges of the stone, leaving a little white highlight toward the top left of each stone. This will just give the appearance that we have a strong light source hitting our stone. I'll talk more about that in a minute. There really is no order to what I'm doing now, but I jumped right over to filling in the mortar with the dark color. And what's nice about this approach is that you can be sloppy. It's still going to produce a good-looking effect. After all, nothing in nature is perfect. Now, if you haven't noticed it already, you can see that the binding coils of my sketchbook are on the right side. If you haven't figured it out, I am left-handed, and those large coils make it incredibly difficult to draw with. So as a result, I tend to flip my sketchbook so that the coils are on the right side, not the left. Although sometimes I forget, and it's always a pain when I'm halfway done with a sketch, trying to rest my hand on those coils. It just doesn't work out. Okay, once I'm done with the mortar, I'm going to use a light gray again to build up just a little bit more shade. And in this case, I'm randomly coloring spots over the stone to keep that geometric appearance. And next, I'll switch over to my dark gray and paint the edges around my stone to make it look like there's a shadow on the undersides. Notice how I'm still focusing this shading on the right edge and bottom edge of each stone. Again, I mentioned earlier about the light source, but I'm visualizing a light source that's coming from the top left of my scene, causing the shadows to be on the bottom right of all my stones. Now, once I'm done with the dark gray color, I'll pick up my darkest gray and I'll just go back over the mortar in between each stone, and that's going to add a little bit more separation and depth. And similar to the brick texture, I will grab my pen again and I will add some additional line work to the texture. I'm going to start with some hatching to embellish the areas of shading underneath the stone. And at this point, there really is no rhyme or reason to where I'm putting my hatch lines. It's just simply trying to mix it up, hoping to give my stone the impression of a more irregular shape. Now, lastly, I'm going to switch over and do a stippling technique similar to what we did with the bricks. And again, this is just going to add a little bit of roughness to each stone, making it feel more like a natural texture. And that's it. Those are the final textures. I hope you'd enjoyed this tutorial.